England, the year 1166. A bitter wind howls across the stone walls of Beaumont Palace in Oxford. Inside, a child-esque cry echoes through the royal chambers, a cry that would one day shape the destiny of a kingdom. This is John Plantagenet, the youngest son of King Henry II of England and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, born into a dynasty built on power, conquest, and conflict. But from the moment he opened his eyes, John's life would be marked by shadows. The shadow of greater brothers, the shadow of betrayal, and the shadow of a crown that would one day destroy him. The house of the Angevins, the Plantagenet family, fiery, ambitious, and endlessly divided. Henry II, John's father, ruled over more land than any English king before him, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, from Ireland to Normandy and Anjou. He was a king of intellect and iron will, but also of storms, both political and personal. Eleanor, John's mother, was once Queen of France, and one of the most powerful women in Europe. Brilliant, beautiful, and bold, she gave Henry not just heirs, but a family that would tear itself apart in pursuit of his throne. By the time John was born, the royal nursery was already full. Henry the young king, Richard Geoffrey, and Matilda, all older, stronger, and already marked for glory. John was the last, the forgotten one, the one without a title, without land, without expectation. Henry jokingly called him John Lecland, the prince with no inheritance but that name. It would stick, and it would shape the man he became. The education of a forgotten prince while his brothers were sent off to rule duchies or command armies. John grew up in the quiet corners of his father's court. He studied languages, law, and administration under the best tutors in Christendom. A reflection of Henry Estrom that one son might inherit his mind rather than his sword. But John wasn't like his father. He was observant, cunning, and ambitious, but also quick to anger, suspicious, and deeply insecure. From childhood, he watched power at close range, but never held it in his own hands. And from that powerlessness grew something dangerous: envy. John learned that in his family, love was a weapon, loyalty was a gamble, and betrayal was a language everyone spoke fluently. The family of war. By the time John was 10, his family was already at war, not with foreign enemies, but with each other. His older brothers, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, rebelled against their father, furious over land and succession. Eleanor, their mother, sided with them, encouraging rebellion from her castle in Poitiers. And where was John? At his father's side. Henry saw in John something different, perhaps loyalty, or perhaps pliability. He began grooming John as his favorite, calling him my little one. When John was still a teenager, Henry arranged a marriage for him to Isabella of Gloucester, a wealthy heiress whose lands would make John powerful in the west of England. At last, John Lecland would have land, but even as fortune smiled, the storm inside the Plantagenet family grew darker. The shadow of Richard the Lionheart. When the dust settled from years of rebellion, only 2 sons remained standing: Richard and John. Richard, the warrior, bold, fearless, adored by his soldiers. John, the schemer, cautious, secretive, and calculating. In 1189, when Henry II finally lay dying at Chinon Castle, he received word that Richard had allied with his greatest enemy, the French king, Philip II, to bring him down. Heartbroken, Henry whispered only one name as he turned his face to the wall: John. But the next words cut deeper than any sword. For even John has betrayed me. Yes, the youngest son, his favorite, had switched sides. John had secretly negotiated with Richard and Philip, hoping to secure his place in whatever new order followed his father's fall. It was a betrayal so deep that, according to chroniclers, Henry II died murmuring, "Shame upon a conquered king, shame upon a faithless son." The age of Richard and the waiting game with Henry dead, Richard the Lionheart took the throne. The age of the Crusader king had begun, banners flying, armor gleaming, and the roar of war echoing across Europe. But Richard had no time for England. He saw the crown as a means to an end, a source of money and men for his grand adventure. The Third Crusade. So he left off to fight Saladin in the Holy Land, leaving behind a kingdom in need of a ruler, and who better to help than his brother John? Richard, perhaps foolishly, trusted him. He gave John lands and titles, including control of parts of England and Ireland. But June wasn't he content to be a caretaker. He wanted the throne itself. The usurper prince, while Richard was thousands of miles away fighting in Jerusalem, John began his quiet campaign at home. He whispered in noble ears. He questioned whether Richard would ever return. He quoted the powerful promising rewards and positions if they backed him as the rightful king in Richard's absence. And when news came that Richard had been captured on his way home, imprisoned by the Holy Roman Emperor, John saw his moment. He seized castles, rice had an army, and even offered money to keep Richard in prison longer. But fate, once again, turned on him. Richard escaped. And when he returned to England in 1194, John's name was cursed across the realm. A brother's mercy, John expected death. But Richard, ever the larger-than-life king, chose mercy, or perhaps humiliation. He pardoned his brother. Publicly. In private. He got it. Him childish and faithless. And to ensure John's loyalty, Richard made him his heir, not out of affection, but calculation. He had no legitimate sons. John's punishment was to wait, to live in the shadow of a brother adored by all the Lion of England, the hero of the Crusades, the king who could do no wrong. And wait he did. For 5 long years, John played the loyal subject. He attended court, collected taxes, and smiled while his envy burned hotter than ever. Then, in April 1199, as Richard besieged a minor French castle, an arrow struck him in the shoulder. The wound turned septic. On his deathbed, Richard turned to those around him and whispered, "Let John have the crown. He is my brother." And just like that, the man who had always been the spare, the schemer, the shadow, became King John of England. The crown and the curse when the news reached England. The reaction was mixed. Some were relieved. The crown had passed peacefully. Others whispered darkly, the worst of the brood now reigns. John was 32 years old. Intelligent, restless, insecure. He had finally achieved everything he ever wanted. Power, respect, authority. But deep inside, he remained that same forgotten boy, desperate to prove himself, terrified to lose what he'd gained. He would be a king like no other. A king both feared and hated. A king who would fight the church, battle his barons, lose his empire, and in the marshes of Runnymede be forced to sign a document that would change the world forever. But that is only the beginning. The young prince who grew up in the shadows had finally stepped into the light, and soon the fire of his reign would consume everything around him. April 1199. The banners of England hang at half. The Lionheart is dead, and in his place now stands his brother, King John, the man no one truly wanted. Yet the only one left. The shadow of Richard still looms large over the kingdom. The people whisper, the barons hesitate, and across the channel, enemies begin to circle like wolves sensing weakness. This is where John's story truly begins. A tale not of glory, but of power, paranoia, and the slow unraveling of a king's soul. The coronation of an uneasy king, May 27th, 1199, Westminster Abbey. The crown of England rests heavy on John's head. The golden circlet that once symbolized his father's brilliance and his brother's valor now feels almost like a curse. Chroniclers say John's hands trembled as he held the scepter. He smiled for the crowds, but those who looked closely saw the unease in his eyes. The eyes of a man who had wanted this all his life, but who already sensed that he might not be strong enough to hold it. And indeed, within days of his coronation, that fear proved true. The French threat. Across the channel, in the court of France, King Philip II, called Philip Augustus, watched events in England with satisfaction. For years, he had battled the Plantagenets, Henry, Richard, and now John, all of whom ruled vast French lands. that Philip believed should belong to him. With Richard gone, Philip saw his chance. He declared that John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, was the rightful heir to the English crown, not John. Arthur was the teenage son of John's late brother, Geoffrey. He was young, idealistic, and easily manipulated. Philip saw in him a pawn, one that could tear the English Empire apart. And so, within months of John's coronation, France and England were at war. The battle for Normandy. John moved swiftly. For all his flaws, he was no fool. He fortified castles, raised troops, and crossed to Normandy to confront the threat. At first, he was successful. His cunning mind, sharp, strategic, outmaneuvered his enemies. In 1200, he struck a deal with Philip, the Treaty of Liguli, which confirmed him as King of England and Duke of Normandy. But peace came at a price. John agreed to pay Philip a massive sum and gave up some lands. Concessions that made him look weak to his own nobles. Still, for a brief moment, it seemed England's new king had brought stability. He married Isabella of Angoulême, a beautiful 12-year-old French heiress whose lands were vital to securing his hold in western France. But there was one problem. Isabella was already betrothed to a powerful French noble named Hugh de Lacy. John didn't care. He took her anyway. That single act, driven by lust and arrogance, would ignite a chain of events that cost him everything. The wrath of France, Hugh de Lusignan, demanded justice. He went to Philip II, who summoned John to his royal court to explain himself. But John refused. He was a king, and in his mind, no man, not even the King of France, could summon him. Philip seized the opportunity. He declared John's French lands forfeit and, once again, backed Arthur of Brittany as the rightful ruler. War exploded across France. The fate of Arthur in 1202. John's army captured Arthur of Brittany near the castle of Mira. The boy was brought before him frightened, defiant, a living reminder of everything John feared. The rival heir, the symbol of legitimacy he could never erase. And then, Arthur vanished. Chroniclers disagreed on what happened next. Some say John ordered his nephew's execution in a drunken rage. Others whispered that John himself plunged the knife into the boy's heart and threw his body into the Seine. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain after that night. Arthur of Brittany was never seen again, and with his disappearance, King John's reputation began to rot. Even his loyal supporters whispered, "If he can murder his own blood, what might he do to us?" The collapse of an empire within 2 years. John's French empire was falling apart. His allies deserted him. His castles fell one by one. By 1204, Normandy, the jewel of the Plantagenet crown, the land his ancestors had ruled since William the Conqueror, was lost to France. It was a humiliation like no other. England's king had lost half his kingdom, not through battle, but through mismanagement, paranoia, and pride. Back home, his barons muttered openly. They began calling him John Softsword, a king unworthy of his ancestors' legacy, the king and his enemies. But John was not done. If he couldn't win through loyalty, he would rule through fear. He raised taxes to rebuild his armies, squeezing every shilling from nobles, merchants, and peasants alike. He demanded military service, confiscated estates, and punished anyone who defied him. He spied on his own men, intercepted letters, and filled his court with informers. No one trusted him, no one loved him, but everyone feared him. His cruelty became legendary. It was said that he imprisoned noble families and starved them to death, that he hanged hostages, blinded children, and sold justice to the highest bidder. And though some of these tales may have been exaggerated by his enemies, one truth remained. King John had transformed England into a realm of suspicion and tyranny. The clash with the church. In 1207, John faced an enemy even more dangerous than the barons, the Church of Rome. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, John refused to accept the Pope's chosen replacement, Stephen Langton. He wanted his own man in that powerful position, but Pope Innocent III would not be challenged. He excommunicated John, cutting him off from the church and declaring England under interdict. That meant no church services, no marriages, no burials. For 6 long years, the bells of England fell silent. Imagine it. No weddings, no baptisms, no funerals. A kingdom spiritually frozen. The people began to whisper that their king was cursed by God. John, however, only grew bolder. He seized church property, mocked the clergy, and filled his treasury with their wealth, until, finally, he realized the danger he was in. Because while the Pope's wrath burned in Rome, the barons' anger burned at home. The humbling of a king by 1213, with rebellion looming. John made a shocking move. He surrendered England to the Pope. Literally. He placed his crown before the papal envoy and declared that he would hold the kingdom as a vassal of Rome, paying tribute every year. It was one of the most humiliating moments in English history. A king kneeling before the church he had defied. But at work, the Pope lifted his excommunication. England was back under divine favor, and John, ever the survivor, was ready to fight again. The battle for the crown with his spiritual problems solved. John turned once more to France. He spent years rebuilding his forces, raising a massive army and navy to reclaim Normandy. In 1214, he launched his campaign. It was his last chance at glory, one final gamble to prove he could be a conqueror like his father and brother before him. But fate had other plans. At the Battle of Bouviens, his allies were crushed by Philip's army. John's dreams of redemption died on that battlefield. He returned to England not as a hero, but as a beaten man. And this time, the barons would not forgive him. The gathering storm by 1215. England was on the brink of civil war. John's barons, the same men who had fought beside his father and brother, rose against him. Furious over his taxes, his abuses, and his failures, they seized London. They demanded a charter, a document to limit the king's power and protect their rights. For the first time in history, the might of the monarchy was being challenged, not by foreign enemies, but by its own people. John was cornered. He could fight and risk losing everything. Or he could sign. And so, on a summer day in June 1215, in a meadow beside the River Thames, King John of England met his barons at a place called Runnymede. There, surrounded by tents, banners, and the murmur of history in motion, he took the pen that would change the world. But as John pressed his royal seal onto the parchment, he did not see freedom or fairness. He saw only defeat. To him, the Magna Carta was not a promise. It was a wound, a mark of his failure as king, and deep within his heart, he swore he would break it. The summer of 1215, England stands divided, a king who rules through fear, a nobility that has had enough, and a nation teetering on the edge of chaos. For nearly 2 decades, King John has bled his kingdom dry in taxes, in loyalty, in patience. Now the barons, once his allies, have become his enemies. Their demands are clear: justice, reform, and an end to royal tyranny. But for a man like John, justice was never about fairness. It was about control. The barons' revolt, the rebellion, began not in open battle, but in whispered oaths. In castles across England, from Lincolnshire to Kent, barons gathered secretly, swearing to stand together against their king. Their leader was Robert Fitzwalter, a proud noble who called himself Marshal of the Army of God and Holy Church. They sent John a list of demands. At first, he laughed, but as castles began to fall, and London itself opened its gates to the rebels, laughter turned to fear. For the first time since taking the throne, John's power was collapsing. In May 1215, the rebels seized control of London, the heart of the kingdom. John's own capital now stood against him. He had no choice but to negotiate. The road to Runnymede, June 1215. On the banks of the River Thames, between Windsor and Staines, a flat green meadow awaited history. It was called Runnymede, a neutral ground chosen so that neither side could claim the upper hand. Under a hot summer sun, tents were raised, soldiers lined the riverbanks, and the two sides met, the king on one side, the barons on the other. Chroniclers describe John Payson in his royal tent, face flushed, lips trembling with anger. He hated every moment, but surrounded by his enemies, he knew resistance would mean war. Unlikely, his death. So he signed. The Magna Carta, the document the barons presented, was unlike anything England had ever seen. It was called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. 63 clauses written in Latin, sealed with red wax, spelling out a revolutionary idea that even the king must obey the law. It promised justice, fair taxation, protection of property, and limits on royal authority. No more could the king imprison men without trial. No more could he seize lands arbitrarily. No more could he rule as an untouchable god. For the barons, it was a triumph. For the church, a victory of morality. But for King John, it was humiliation written on parchment. When the ink dried, the king muttered bitterly, "They have given me a name of shame," and in his heart, he swore vengeance. The king's revenge. Barely weeks after signing the Magna Carta, John began plotting his retaliation. He had no intention of keeping his promises. He claimed he had signed under duress, that the charter was void, forced upon him by traitors. He wrote to the Pope, begging for help. "Pope, innocenter Ciro, ever protective of his new vassal king," responded swiftly. He declared the Magna Carta illegal and excommunicated the rebel barons. John smiled for the first time in months. The Pope had just given him divine permission to go to war. The First Barons' War. By late 1215, the country descended into civil war. King John unleashed his fury on the realm. He marched north, burning towns, besieging castles, and crushing any who resisted. In one brutal campaign, he stormed Rochester Castle, a rebel stronghold. The siege lasted nearly 2 months. John's forces tunneled under the castle walls, setting fires that brought the great keep crashing down. When the defenders finally surrendered, John ordered them all starved to death. The message was clear. Mercy was for the weak. The king was taking back his crown by blood and fire. The barons seek a new king. The rebels realized they could not defeat John alone. So they did something extraordinary. They invited a foreign prince to invade England. They turned to Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, John's lifelong rival. Louis accepted eagerly. He landed in Kent in May 1216 with an army of thousands, proclaiming himself King of England by right of rebellion. Half the barons joined him. Even London opened its gates to the French prince. For John, it was the ultimate betrayal. His own nobles had offered his crown to a foreigner. A king in flight by summer, John was on the run. From castle to castle, he fled across his kingdom, clutching what remained of his treasure and his pride. He trusted no one. Not his soldiers, not his advisors, not even his own men-at-arms. Chroniclers say he slept in armor, ate little, and often raged into the night, cursing the barons and spitting at the mention of the Magna Carta. He grew paranoid, consumed by vengeance and fear, a king haunted by his own shadow. The disaster in the Wash then came October 1216, the defining calamity of John's life. He was traveling across eastern England, his treasury wagon following behind, loaded with gold, jewels, and royal relics. His plan was to cross the tidal estuary known as the Wash, a stretch of marshland between Norfolk and Lincolnshire. But the tide came in faster than expected. As John's men tried to cross, the wagons sank into the mud. Chests, crowns, swords, everything disappeared beneath the rising water. All his wealth, his symbols of power, gone in a single tide. 2 medieval mines. It was more than a disaster. It was a sign from God. The curse of a tyrant fulfilled. When John heard the news, he reportedly collapsed in despair. The king's last days. Soon after, John fell ill, feverish, weak, and tormented. Some said it was dysentery. Others whispered poison. He retreated to Newark Castle, shivering with fever, his mind drifting between delirium and regret. Witnesses say that even as he lay dying, he could not escape his bitterness. He cursed the barons, the church, the French, and fate itself. But in a rare moment of lucidity, he called for his 9-year-old son, Henry, and his loyal knight, William Marshall, one of the few men still devoted to him. Head took Henry's hand and whispered, Let the boy have what I could not keep. Let him be a better king. That night, October 19th, King John of England died at the age of 49. When news of his death spread, the reaction was complex. Few mourned him. Many simply sighed in relief. Chroniclers wrote that hell itself was made fouler by the presence of John. It was a harsh epitaph, even for a king so despised. Yet, in the midst of war and ruin, something remarkable happened. William Marshal, acting as regent for young Henry III, reissued the Magna Carta, this time as a royal promise, not a royal humiliation. And that reissue, that act of renewal, transformed a failed peace treaty into a foundation of liberty. The legacy of rebellion, John's death, did not end his story. It began a legacy that would outlive him by centuries, because the Magna Carta, once torn apart by a furious king, became the cornerstone of constitutional government. It inspired the idea that no ruler is above the law, a concept that shaped not just England, but the modern world. From the English Parliament to the American Constitution, its echoes can still be heard. Due process, trial by jury, freedom under law. All of it traces back to a meadow beside the Thames and a reluctant king named John. Cinematic closing, soft orchestral score arising. Narrated tone reflective, he was a man of contradictions. Intelligent yet insecure, powerful yet paranoid. A ruler who built the foundations of modern freedom by trying to destroy it. King John wanted to be remembered as a strong monarch, a second Henry II, a man who bent the world to his will. Instead, history remembers him as the villain king, the tyrant who, through his own downfall, gave birth to liberty. And perhaps, in that irony, lies his true legacy, because sometimes, even the darkest kings cast the longest shadows. The year was 1215. King John stood at the edge of history, trapped between rebellion and ruin. His once mighty kingdom had turned against him. His nobles no longer bowed in loyalty, but in contempt. The Lionheart's brother, the son of Henry II, had become a monarch despised, feared, and cornered. For years, the barons of England had watched John squeeze them dry with taxes, strip them of lands, and humiliate them in his courts. His war with France had ended in disaster, the great loss of Normandy still fresh in every English heart. His enemies saw weakness, and weakness invited defiance. They gathered their banners, red, gold, and black, and marched on London. Their demand was simple, yet earth-shaking. The king must obey the law. At first, John laughed. A king obey the law. To him, it was absurd. Kings made law. They did not kneel before it. But when London itself opened its gates to the rebels, the laughter died in his throat. June 1215. Runnymede, a quiet meadow by the River Thames, became the stage for one of history. Yes, most immortal moments. The king rode in on horseback, his face pale with exhaustion. Opposite him stood the rebel barons, proud, armored, unyielding. Between them, the Archbishop of Canterbury held a parchment, a document that would change the world. The Magna Carta. As the quills scratched and seals were pressed, John's trembling hand met history. He had no love for the document, no belief in its promises, but he signed it nonetheless, because he had no choice. His army was weak, his treasury empty, and his nobles were ready to crown another man if he refused. The Magna Carta, the Great Charter, declared that no king, no matter how divine his claim, was above the law. It promised justice, trial by peers, protection from illegal imprisonment, and the right to fair taxation. To modern eyes, it was the birth of liberty. To John, it was humiliation. A dagger plunged into the heart of royal authority. As he left the meadow, John's face hardened. The ink on the parchment was not yet dry, but his betrayal was already in motion. He would never honor the Magna Carta. He would tear it apart, word by word, clause by clause, and make the barons pay for their arrogance. And so, the ink of peace turned quickly into the blood of war. Within weeks, John called upon mercenaries from across the Channel. He burned rebel lands, seized castles, and hunted his enemies with ruthless precision. The barons, desperate, turned to an unlikely savior, Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II. They invited him to invade England and take the crown. It was treason of the highest order, but to them, John was no longer their king. Louis landed with a French army in 1216, and for the first time since William the Conqueror, a foreign prince marched through English soil, claiming the throne. The kingdom plunged into chaos. John was furious. He stormed through the countryside, burning towns, destroying crops, and punishing any who dared question his crown. His temper, once a weapon, had become a poison driving allies away, leaving him isolated. In the autumn of 1216, fate finally came for King John. After sacking the Abbey of Crowland and looting church property, he fled north through the marshes of Lincolnshire, carrying his treasure, gold, jewels, and the royal crown itself in wagons. Then came the flood. His baggage train sank into the muddy waters of the Wash, swallowed by the tide. The wagons vanished beneath the waves, along with the royal crown. John watched helplessly as his fortune disappeared, his men drowning before his eyes. To the superstitious medieval mind, it was a sign he had lost not only his treasure, but the favor of God. Weakened and feverish, John stumbled to Newark Castle. The once proud king, who had defied popes and barons alike, now lay shivering on his bed, surrounded by a handful of loyal knights. His face was pale, his voice hoarse. Some said he had eaten too many peaches. Others whispered that he had been poisoned by a monk. But perhaps it was simpler. The weight of his sins had crushed his spirit long before his body failed. On October 19th, 1216, at the age of 49, King John of England died. No royal procession followed, no bells rang. The people did not mourn. They rejoiced. In the cold dawn light, a few monks carried his body to Worcester Cathedral, burying him before the high altar. Thus ended the reign of one of England's most hated yet historically pivotal monarchs. After John's death, his 9-year-old son was crowned King Henry III. The barons, now leaderless and weary of war, abandoned Prince Louis and pledged loyalty to the boy king. To secure peace, Henry's regents reissued the Magna Carta. This time, in good fight. The document that John had despised now became the cornerstone of English governance. John had failed to destroy it. Instead, he had given it immortality. Ironically, the man who tried to crush liberty became the reason it survived. The Magna Carta would echo through the centuries, inspiring the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the very idea that even kings must answer to their people. From the fields of Runnymede to the halls of Philadelphia, its spirit endured a whisper that said, "Power must be bound by justice." King John's reign was one of disaster, lost lands, rebellion, betrayal. He alienated his nobles, quarreled with the church, and broke every oath he swore. Yet, paradoxically, his failure reshaped England. Without his tyranny, there would have been no Magna Carta. Without the Magna Carta, the path to democracy might have taken centuries longer. In history's cruel irony, John's cruelty became the foundation of freedom. He was not the hero England wanted. He was the lesson it needed. A king who lost everything, and in doing so, gave birth to an idea greater than any crown. King John, the monarch who signed the Magna Carta, the failure who made freedom possible.